You ready? Are you guys, you're ready? All right. All right, hello everyone. I am Donofrio, and this is Adithya, Mathai. We are from the Raleigh office, and we're both directors. So I have been at the firm for 11 years now, and have worked in the corporate and shared services practice for most of that time. I had a couple energy projects at the beginning of my career, but I think 2 years in I started working on a HR project and more or less have never looked back. So I'll let Adithya introduce himself.
Similar approach, came from UNC, thought I was going to come in and do energy work, and I had a background at CEB, Corporate Executive Board up in DC, and then prior to that, consulting in pharmaceuticals. So had sort of HR, finance background. Very similar experience, sort of did an energy project, and then following that ended up doing a major finance redesign shared service project. Sort of never really looked back from there. Even have dabbled in energy, worked at APS in Arizona, but even then it was a finance HR redesign, so it was with a utility, but it's very organizationally inclined as opposed to energy based. Good.
Yeah, similarly, the couple energy clients who I worked for did very HR-focused work or supply chain-focused work. So anyway, we're here today to talk to you about the corporate and shared services practice. Our agenda today, we're going to cover a number of things around what is corporate and shared services. It's probably one of the more difficult terms to describe. It took me a while to get my elevator pitch right when people said, "What do you do?" and, "Oh, well, what's that?" You know, it takes a little while. So we're going to talk about what the key terms are and how you describe what we do. We're also going to talk about some of the projects that we work on and what are the type of subjects that we focus on outside of just HR and finance and IT. We're going to delve a little bit into what does that mean and what does the structure of the projects look like, and a couple case studies. We will talk about some of our project locations, kind of length of time that we work on them. They're different in context to a lot of our energy projects, and so we'll learn a little bit about that. Talk about how the practice is organized, who the key people are, so you get to know kind of who the experts are across the landscape of Scott Madden. And then we'll take questions the whole time. So do feel free. Both Adithya and I are pretty informal in our presentation style. I think most people are who come to this. So do feel free if something doesn't make sense or if you've got a question as you go, just raise your hand and we'll address it. One thing is a bit of a disclaimer is, you know, we're given 2.5 hours for this presentation, and teaching you guys about corporate and shared services takes a whole lot longer than that. So what we're going to do today is instead of giving you, this isn't really like a 101 presentation. We're not really giving you the basics so that you could walk into a project and start talking. What we want to do is give you an orientation to the type of work, some of the key terms, and what the practice is all about, who's in the practice. And so the actual, how to do it and what the theory is and what our methodologies are will come once you get assigned to a project. You'll learn as you go, and on-the-job training is key. That's one of the biggest things about Scott Madden. You learn everything once you start doing it. So to give you a little bit of a practice at a glance, the corporate and shared services practice area does contribute significantly to the firm's revenue. Energy usually makes up about 60%, and corporate and shared services is about 40% of the overall revenue. And energy does, in this context, include the large scope of clean tech as well, and grid transformation. And over the last few years, the practice has continued to grow. So you can see a 9% increase over 7 years, and over the last 5 years, it's grown by 16.9%. So as we've been growing as a firm, the practice area has really been keeping pace along the whole way. The total of number of projects has grown. I started in 2006, and we had about 56 corporate and shared services projects at that time. Last year we did 103. And the type of projects that we do is a mix by function. So when you think about what is in the corporate and shared services world, these are the focus areas. So you've heard us talk about HR, you've heard us talk about finance and accounting. IT and supply chain make up a portion of that revenue or those projects as well. And multifunction is considered shared services organizations that cover more than one of these functions. So it's often finance and HR are paired together. You can also have components of IT. So that's where we often see a mixture of functions across. And multifunction is usually represented in some of the more mature shared services organizations that we work with. It seems to be more common for a company to try to consolidate or centralize one service at a time, and as they become more established, then they can kind of build in, add scope as they go. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in our discussion today. The other category refers to the fact that corporate services across industries many of them can be addressed in a shared services environment, even if it's not something particularly typical. Like, for example, universities. Last year or the year before in the University of Saskatchewan project, one of the main areas of focus for the Shared Services Center was research. And so we don't typically see research as a function in shared services, but for a large university system, they did need to centralize and manage services related to their research function in a way that we typically approach IT and HR. You can also do facilities, and so we see that sometimes in the other.
You'll see this later on when we talk to Kaiser, but marketing, sales operations. So those are things you'd typically see sort of in that corporate space, but
right.
More and more. And Molly will sort of talk to this. Shared service has been around for a little while, and so what's starting to happen is I'll say the basics are starting to get covered predominantly in all of these industries, right? So they've already got finance, they've already got HR, they've already got IT, and so now they're starting to go up the value chain, for lack of a better word. And part of that is going to these areas that previously were in corporate, and they're starting to say, okay, how do we start to scale this? How do we start to actually engage all the business units in that process?
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the characteristics of services and how you transition them into a shared services model. So you'll see as we start talking about what are the characteristics of what you're looking for, you can see how that can start to be broader. You can say, oh, research, marketing, these are things that we really want to be more efficient in our delivery, and so we'll put it into the model. So when we think about the types of projects that we do in the corporate and shared services world, most of our work is in assessments. And assessments, we can be called in to do all sorts of different types of assessments. So a company is thinking about going into or developing shared services, and they're at the very beginning of their journey, and they want to do, say, a work activity survey to figure out how people are spending their time, and they want to understand what the scope of their processes looks like today. So that can be very early on. And that often comes with kind of a current state assessment and then a future state design that then can hopefully bring you into the next phase of implementing that design. We also are asked to do a number of assessments for companies that, say, implemented shared services but did it themselves and may have done it kind of in pieces. And they want to understand, well, what do we do next to up our game? What do we do to continue to further this process along? So we will go in and assess kind of where they are mid-journey, if you will. We also are often asked to do assessments after a service center has been running for a number of years. So a 10-year assessment to say, where are we from a best practice perspective? Let's have have a number of our metrics compared against your benchmarks and see how we're doing competitively and comparatively and where we can put process improvement in place. So assessments take up most of our work. They do tend to be shorter in duration. So assessments can run anywhere from 4 weeks to 3 months, kind of depending upon what the scope is. Do you think that sounds about right?
Yeah, absolutely.
4 to 12 weeks.
You always have those
The outliers. Yeah. So assessments are usually about that long. Implementations are big. They're 28% of our work, and that's really the bread and butter because implementations are long. As you may have heard a number of people talk about long scale projects that they've been on at Scott Madden, a lot of them are implementations because these usually take at a minimum 9 to 12 months. And at a max, I think we've done 3 and 4 year implementations for clients. So it really depends upon the scale and scope of what someone's trying to implement, how many processes, how many employees. You'll hear reference to HCA, which was a big implementation for Hospital Corporations of America that finished up last year. And I think that was 3.5 years, 4 years. 4 years, but 200,000 employees. A lot of hospitals. So it takes, how many? 165 hospitals. So it takes time, obviously, to roll out that scope to the breadth of the organization that size. Other companies will say, let's do this big bang, roll it out all at once, but that still takes about, it's a year is kind of the benchmark there. Then on the tail end of our project mix, improvement, strategy, and other. Improvement comes in to play when I talked a little bit about assessments when people are figuring out how to get better, how to increase their analytics use, how to get closer to leading practice benchmarks. We will often help them either with a certain process or a technology, something related to help them get better. So that's a portion. And then strategy often comes at the front end of how do we do this? How do we get involved in figuring out how to implement shared services? How do we go global? How do we change into a multifunction organization? How do we distribute our services effectively across the globe? So when you think about when we have an international focus to our projects, it's often in shared services because many of the companies that we work with are global corporations and most of them with North American headquarters who are looking how to expand this more broadly.
Before you jump, Molly, so 2 things I want to call out on this slide that sort of to tie it a little bit together. So as Molly's saying, we do shared service, corporate and shared services. We've been doing it for thereabouts of 18 years, sort of coming
since
out
the late
of the
90s,
right,
yeah.
Coming out of the sort of regulation, deregulation in utilities. And I think this is great because it highlights 2 things. One, from a skill set perspective as consultants, you're going to need a couple of different tools in your toolbox. So you sort of have the very, sort of, I'll say, typical consulting general management as part of the strategy work. That's sort of big picture thinking, sort of Venn diagram, pretty graphs on the slide, that sort of thing. And then you've got this very detailed depth into a functional space, particularly as you get into implementation, where you really get sort of honed in on a particular function, whether in that project, whether that's finance, whether that's HR, whether that's IT. And so your ability to sort of navigate the altitudes, for lack of a better word, becomes so much more useful because you can work with a client at the head of HR level or the CFO level, as well as a manager of accounts payable, and you can navigate that altitude. And what I've typically found is a lot of our competitors struggle with that in one individual. That's what we sort of bring. The other piece that I'll call out is our competition historically has been sort of in the strategy space, right? So McKinsey will sort of win out on the strategy predominantly. We'll work on sort of a shared service piece. What we're seeing is they're seeing all of the value that the depth brings and the assessments and the implementations. And so we're seeing them more into this space. But what I'm again finding is our history here, sort of this bedrock, is a differentiator and makes us as sort of consultants a whole lot better. So as you get into this space, know that this is, I think, what really helps make us as consultants different, because we have that ability to go deep into a particular area where others may not.
All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about the corporate and shared services practice in depth. So what is this? What are we talking about? So what is shared services? Like I said, this is a hard one to define. And this is our kind of marketing focused definition that we've got out there. So I'm going to stop and let you guys read it for a minute.
I don't know about you guys, but I always struggle following the
arrows,
the sequence.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you what it is in my own words. So shared services is it's the practice of taking services that are typically live in a corporate environment, like your overhead services, HR, finance, IT, supply chain, and it is putting them into a function that runs as its own business that serves different members of the corporation or the company as if they're a business partner or a business outside of the business. And this came about, as Adithya mentioned, really from the energy and utility industry. So in the 90s, when the utility industry went through all of these changes in the market, they needed to become a lot more cost competitive, and they needed to figure out how they could decrease headcount and increase service and standardize their processes and run the corporate function as if it's a business, actually charge back for services. And so Scott Madden's work started in this area back then, when we already had all of these energy clients who were trying to change their way of doing business, and that's where we started getting involved. What it has evolved to over time is that there's a lot of benefit and a lot of value from pulling services out from a redundant fashion, standardizing them, and delivering them in a central way that brings a lot of other things, like customer service can be really high. Value of service delivery with using technology can be really high when you've got it all coming from one central area. And so companies no longer are solely focused on cost. They come to us and say, we're having a really hard time with customer service. People hate the way these things are delivered. And so by looking at each service by process, and figuring out how to kind of segregate the way it's delivered, whether or not it's delivered via technology, with a call center staff to help support it, with specialists who can answer your deeper questions, or whether or not you need face-to-face interaction. You can deliver your services in a more efficient manner. So some of our companies still focus on kind of a chargeback model, where they will charge the business for the amount of work that they produce, but others don't. They just say, we want to do this because it's good for the company, and we can deliver better service and better value that way. So I know that's still probably gray, and we'll get into more detail, but go ahead.
Just curious, since you guys are sort of recent grads, sort of had been out in the marketplace, how many folks sort of heard about customer experience titles or saw customer experience titles, right? It's starting to sort of be the, I'll say, relatively recent buzzword, VP of customer experience, consumer experience, so forth. There's a big element of shared service that comes with that, because what you're seeing with mobile technology, and you guys, I'm sure, experience it or expect it as customers yourselves, I'm looking for a seamless experience, right? So whether I'm working in this part of the business or that part of the business, if I get on a call, if I call Delta and I get transferred, I'm expecting that person, that agent, sort of that just got the handoff, I don't have to repeat myself, right? And if I do, I get annoyed. So there's this seamless integration of experience that actually plays very well into the shared service world, because that's essentially what a lot of what you're trying to do. You're trying to create, besides compliance and besides efficiencies and besides cost savings, you're trying to create a common experience. You're trying to remove redundancies. And so try to make it real for you all. That customer experience is it's a different word, but underpinning that to make that work is going to be an element of shared service.
Right. So when you think about shared services, and you've already heard me say the word centralized and standard, what the theory here is for shared services is that it combines the best of both worlds. So when you have a decentralized model, and let's think about kind of the hospital example that HCA is. When you have a decentralized model, every one of those hospitals has their own like corporate infrastructure, right? So there are HR people who sit at the hospital who are responsible for kind of all the HR service delivery in that area. And they may have policies that are kind of corporate, but as soon as some of the leadership at the hospital says, I don't like that policy, they change it because they can, because that's each hospital gets to operate kind of as its own decentralized thing. On the flip side, and so I'll just say some of the things that we see in a decentralized model is redundancy. All of those HR people answering the same policy questions 165 times over is just not an efficient way of doing business. So it's redundant, it's inefficient, and it's not standardized. So for a company who's trying to make sure that they're delivering their service most efficiently, it's the worst way. But employees love this. This is the favorite of all employees because they get personalized service. They know who to go to. They say, knock, 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 I have a question for my HR person, and they know where they sit, and they are going to spend time, sitting across from me, and everybody, this is where customers and employees say that they're most happy because they get whatever they want, basically.
Managers struggle with this a little bit more, right? So if you take that hospital example. So if I'm a manager at hospital A and I move to hospital B, well, all of a sudden it's like I'm at the same company.
I'm in a new place.
I'm still doing this, maybe even the same job. I'm sort of a department head in the ER. All of a sudden I've got to learn a whole new set of hiring policies, learning and development policies, et cetera. Why? So the consumer, the employee, will sort of have that very personal connection, which is great, that customer-focused element. Mm-hmm. But the lack of standardization sort of just creates a lot of inefficiencies. So you don't want to lose that customer focus, but you'd like to do it in a more efficient manner.
So then we go to the other side of the scale and think about centralized. And this kind of brings to mind like old school bureaucracy when I think about this big old model of churning from a big department where all the HR people are sitting together, and it's efficient because you don't have that kind of redundancy of people doing the same job, sitting in the same place, delivering the same kind of answers all the time. But it's very detached from the business. Everyone sits far away in some place. Nobody knows who your HR people are. It's inflexible. There's usually a lot of bureaucracy and policy and rules, and it's inflexible. So it's efficient. You get great economies of scale, and there's usually standard processes that people can rely on. But it's not very business intelligent. And so shared services came about to combine the best of both worlds, to put a central model together that focuses on service, that focuses on standard processes, but delivers the service in a way that's a lot more flexible. So tiered service delivery is one of the ways that it becomes more flexible, and I'll talk about that on the next slide or two. But and when I say central, it doesn't mean that it's all sitting in one place, kind of like the old model. Central speaks more to central reporting structures. So you can have employees sitting in multiple locations, but everyone is like marching to the same drum, basically. They are working off the same processes. They're working off the same technology. They may have reporting structure that all goes up into the same place so that they can then roll things out.
Yeah, it's a great call out. I recently have been using streamlined and consolidated because I find folks equate, when I say central, to centralized.
Right.
Sort of they equate it to a geographic analogy, which shared service is not. It's consolidated, it's streamlined. shared service does not equal centralization.
Right.
Just having this conversation last week.
Right. So any questions on what we've been talking about before we move on? We'll get a little deeper into the models. So benefits of a shared services model. This is the slide you'll see a lot if you start working in shared services, because this is often what we go back to. And I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, what do clients want? What are they looking for when they want to implement shared services? And it's usually one of these three things, or it can be multiple, it can be all of them. So at the bottom we start with cost control. So elimination of redundant labor is a big thing. When you centralize a reporting structure, you can have people deliver services to several hospitals at once as opposed to just the one they were delivering to before. And so it usually means a headcount reduction or a headcount redeployment, but that is one of what the biggest cost containment areas for shared services. It's aligning work to the appropriate skill set. So earlier when I was talking about processes, when you look at kind of all the elements of a process and you figure out, is this a tier 0? Is this a tier 1? Is this a tier 2? Is this a tier 3? So that goes from, is this basic, can be answered by technology, this is something that can be automated, that's tier 0. Is it tier 1? That's considered relatively transactional in nature and more administrative. That becomes, you can kind of focus the people and the work, those process steps, into that area so that you're aligning your skill sets with work type alignment. And then as it gets more complicated, it goes to specialist groups. And so in the Delta model, if you think about, when you call, you get an initial reservationist. That's someone we would consider a tier 1, because they're the ones who are taking the initial intake off the phone. They're the ones who have kind of a standard routine to go through and are delivering basic service. But a couple weeks ago, I needed to get a refund for a ticket, and I needed to be transferred to another department that just dealt with refunds. So it's the same thing. That we'd call that a tier 2 group that specializes just in refunds. And so this model is seamless. So you get the case gets passed to the next person, and they're supposed to have the detail. But anyway, I'm getting more deep into the model, and I'll go down that path in a little while. So let's go back to some of the benefits. So gaining control and leveraging data. That's probably one of the biggest complaints we hear from clients recently is, I don't know what's going on. Like I don't have visibility into my processes. We have all this data being collected, but I don't know what to do with that. Like we hear, obviously the buzzwords are all about big data and analytics these days. And a lot of our clients are like, we have the technology to be able to track and pull this stuff, but it's not aligned. We don't know what it means. It's not coming from the same source. So control of reporting from a financial perspective, from a compliance perspective is a big driver for large companies, because otherwise they just don't have any transparency into what their true costs are or what the metrics and benchmarks related to their work. They can't measure any of it. And then finally, it's improve service and enable scalability. So when you have a model that can effectively reach a number of different employees or customers at once, you can scale that up faster. And by having standard processes that can be applied to many different groups, companies can deal well with acquisitions. They can add employee groups that without a whole lot of disruption to the business. And it's very attractive to have this type of model for a company who has a number of different types, like a holding company who has a number of different types of businesses, to any group that's looking to grow through acquisition. So making sure that there's standard processes and a way to deliver that in one way is a common driver as well for this model. So this is where I started getting a little into the details of tiers in our last discussion. So this slide speaks to what a leading practice service delivery model is for HR. So when we go into our HR clients, this is our objective of what we're trying to build for them. And I'll walk through it for you. Let me see if I can get the pointer to work. Yes. So on the outside, you've got employees, managers, people managers, and vendors who all have a business need, have something that they need from HR, whether or not it's questions about their benefits plan or questions about their comp and their pay, or whether or not it's, I need help with managing this employee, I don't understand how to do their personal development plan, or I need, someone's getting ready to go out on a leave of absence and I don't know what to do about that. Those are some of the kind of typical HR related questions you would get from over here. And what we want to do is take any of those processes and determine whether or not they are Tier 0 related, which means you can access this from a portal, an employee portal, where it's backed up by technology that we call a knowledge base. So it's filled with all of the Q&A that you could have about all the programs that your company offers. And you, as an employee, can go out there and look yourself and say, okay, that's how I apply for a leave of absence. It's self-service. Then, so that's the very basic, and the desire is to drive a lot of the work there, your simple Q&A there. Well, let's say you need to apply for a leave of absence and you understand the policy, you've completed your form, you know what to do, but you need help with that. You need to actually put the process in place, and you need to ask them some questions about what this really means for you. Then there's the level of Tier 1 or Tier 2 support that is in a service center, people on the phones, answering questions, accessing all the same technology that you accessed from the outside. And they also have access to case management systems so that they can enter in your information, and they can pass that along to whoever it needs to go to. And then they also, on the back end, can figure out how long it took them to address that case, what the metrics were in turnaround time, how many leave of absence cases this company gets on a frequent basis. So the case management and the knowledge base are key to being able to drive that data that the company is looking for. So that's Tier 1 and Tier 2. Let's say that there's something that goes wrong while you're out on your leave of absence and you need specialized support in order to come back and return to work. That typically goes to what we consider a specialist group in Tier 2. And they would then consult with what we call our centers of expertise, who are the groups within HR who govern the policies. So they're the ones who can kind of approve exceptions. They're the ones who can say, this is a special situation, let's talk with leadership and figure out what we need to do about this. And so COEs in the HR world are benefits, compensation, leadership and development, global mobility, employee relations, labor relations. So those are your key groups that are the ones who are out there building all the policies, who then provide direction to all these processes on how they're delivered. Then you've still got your element of the HR business partner, and these are the people who are out in the field. So in this model, you still need people who are there on site, whether or not it's shared across sites, or they're there in person, or it's a virtual relationship. We see them in a lot of different ways. But these are the people who are working with business leaders to develop things like recruiting strategies. So what are your top jobs, and are you having difficulty getting applicants for these? Let's figure out what we do to create programs specific to that business. So, if it's something that is not your typical, you may have to work with the business to say, well, let's figure out how we attract these candidates. They're the ones who also do the difficult employee relations work. So when you think about harassment or any kind of grievances that come from having a large employee base, that's this group as well. So they're still the ones who are there to work with what we like to call more strategic HR issues. And in the past, and in a number of companies that you still see, this group is kind of bogged down by a lot of the transactional nature of the work that's inherent in HR that you want to push to someone else. Because as an HR business partner, the drive now and the direction is to be the ones who are more tied into what does the business really need? How do I help these leaders focus on making more money for them, getting the right people in the door, and building things like workforce plans and succession plans and talent acquisition plans. So that's the overall breakdown of the HR service delivery model. You can see that there's components are all there. They don't necessarily all sit in the same building, but they all are integrated in the way they approach processes.
Just to connect back to that centralized, decentralized, right, in the best of both worlds. So simplistically, I always like to think, and you'll see this on the finance, this is your field, your HR business partners. This is your decentralized component of the model. This is the group that knows the business unit issues and leaders, and can raise and can tailor solutions to that business. This and that are sort of the benefits of that centralized model, the standardization, the policies. Here's what good looks like. And so you really get both worlds. And the diagrams you'll see, I know the first time you look at it, it can sometimes look a little complicated, but I always like to think of sort of these three pieces as sort of being the centralization, the standardization, the efficiency creation, and this being so important to not to not become your ivory tower. You've got to have your business unit sort of interface right there.
Okay, so when we talk about finance has a little bit of a different model. They have more circles and boxes on the slide, so it gets a little bit more complicated.
But it's largely, but there's a lot of similarities. You'll sort of see it as Molly goes through it.
Yeah. So one of the differences in finance is that there are a lot more processes that are automated and don't require that kind of employee interaction. HR, a number of things can be taken on that tier 0, don't need to talk to the people, but even more can be in finance. And so when you look at the way the organization of the tiers is, there's often a differentiation between people who are employee facing and can talk to, say, a line manager who's trying to put their business plan together, and they have some questions around how the process works, versus processes like AP and AR and billing, where information or requests or cases come in straight from technology. You get that invoice in from the scan, you process it, you push it on to the next point. So that is why there's that difference in how those processes are set up from the beginning. But we do have the same type of organization, in that there is advanced issue resolution in the tier 2. There's a COE, which the Centers of Expertise in Finance really help focus on financial planning and forecasting, performance, analytics, budgeting, pricing, and audit. And those COEs similarly set the policies and set the rules for the way these transactions are meant to be carried out. And then locally, you've got your business unit finance, who are there to support the business, to help them through the processes of whatever cycle it is that they have to plan, and know specifically what the needs are of those business leaders. I'm not the finance expert in the room, Adithya is, so let's see if he has anything to add.
Yeah, no, we us finance folks aren't very good with people, so we separate those. we get good people-facing folks, and we get good finance folks.
Yeah.
But again, what I would emphasize is, and this is where, as we get into marketing and things like that, the model is very similar. You got to identify your stakeholders. You got to find your sort of multi-channel way to intake that. You sort of keep, what are you going to drive consistency into, whether it's sort of in the service center, in the COEs, or in corporate finance, but sort of there's this, what's the consolidated common perspective you're going to take, and then what's the local flavor you're going to retain, and how are you going to do that? And so the model remains very similar. The components have got to adapt to the particular functional area, but the model stays the same.
Yeah.
Yesterday, Trey mentioned that robotics was becoming more popular in finance.
That's true.
Not just in finance, but that's
In
right.
shared services
Yeah.
altogether. Where on this box, is automation and robotics separated, or can it be? I know that it's not all.
So great question, and we'll actually have a slide on some of that. But what I would say is, I'd rephrase your question to say, where is it integrated rather than separated? And the reality is it's integrated everywhere. But the place I would really look at is in this central component, both here and here.
Yep.
Because robotics is all about rules-based, activities, and so the consistency is what's valuable. The local flavor is all about differentiating, right? It's all about the exceptions. And so our PA is really, both in finance, HR, elsewhere, is really about what you can do here. And if you sort of take Molly's tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, it's what you can sort of essentially move into tier 0. What becomes touchless, right? What do you essentially have someone just monitor and rather than actually do anything? And so it's a lot of the work is happening here and affecting the processes that are in here. Great question.
Was there another question there?
Yeah, I was wondering, so if you're working on finance for a client, maybe some of the process or recommendations could affect other business units. How do you deal with that kind of situation?
Great question. So, and I would say the answer is not maybe. It's
Always.
Almost always.
Yeah.
And so that's what you'll find. Shared services is not a, by its nature, it's a shared service. It will inherently affect the entire organization. So whether you're doing it a multifunction or whether you're doing a particular like HR or finance, you're going to affect the entire organization. Change management is huge. What you'll find, and that's where those assessments and those implementations get so much value, it's because you have to be able to do the start, stop, continue. And you've got to talk to everyone that's interconnected in there, sort of the spider web effect. That's why these projects don't happen overnight. That's why they take time. You end up interfacing with pretty much everyone in the organization, because even in finance, pretty much everyone gets impacted in one way or another, even your vendors, right? So you're not just affecting your client, you're affecting folks outside of your client.
Right, so in our implementation work streams, we usually have a couple, and they can be very large groups of people focusing on elements of change management and elements of training and marketing. So the first parts of our projects always end up focusing a lot on the function. Trying to figure out, doing process re-engineering, figuring out what kind of technology needs to be implemented, and making sure all that stuff starts coming together in a seamless way. But alongside of all that work is a lot of stakeholder management. So meeting with the key stakeholders, that could be VPs across all the different business units. It could be elements of people that we've determined have to be kept in the loop along the way, and then also have to be part of the launch of the new process. So when we do implementations, we designate a day for go live day, depending upon when it is. It could be launch of the whole model, it could be a huge big bang change, or it could be we're getting ready to roll out this new process and this new technology, and everybody needs to know how to do that. So it's often accompanied by a fair amount of marketing across the business. So big campaigns, we do, employee events, we get people in lunchrooms,
Logos.
we give prizes, we do all that kind of stuff to build awareness. And then we also more or less say there's a drop dead date. So today is the day we are going live with this new process. You change today, there is no more of this other. So that's why, again, why these projects are long, because it usually comes with a fair amount of build up and insurance that the business is going to change.
Just to make it real for you, take HCA just as an example. Matt Christek, who you'll all meet in the Atlanta office, there was a period where he basically spent an entire month training managers on all the new HR processes for a particular business unit that was going to go. So just if you can picture sort of about 2 weeks straight, every day, meeting with another group of about 300 hiring managers to run through, and that was just one business unit. So we're sort of neck deep in making sure that interconnectivity works.
Right. And I would say that that's actually something I think we differentiate and we do really well at Scott Madden. We are extremely focused as consultants on making things work and making sure that we leave the client with a workable, implementable solution. And so that's why we're so engaged in that part. We build our teams in order to make sure that change management is the biggest component of ensuring that these things stick. You can build a whole model like this, and if you don't reach the right people and you don't force a change, they'll sit there and not get used, and people will just keep doing what they were doing before. So that is something that I think we focus on specifically, and I've seen us do very well over the years and better than our competitors. It's something we really want to make sure that they get. I think I covered most of this slide already, which speaks to the fact that it's an old practice area. It's been around since the late 90s now, and it started out in utilities in the energy industry, but now it crosses all industries. So we'll cover what type of work the clients that we work in on the next few slides. I think we covered all of that too, so I'm going to move ahead. These are some of our representative clients. So you can tell when I spoke about industry, it really crosses industry, from consumer products and services, manufacturing, technology, public sector, energy, utilities, healthcare and pharmaceuticals, and professional services. Every corporation has HR, finance, IT, supply chain, and can use this type of focus. So you'll see a number of recognizable brands here, and we've done a varied scope across all of these companies. So some we've done kind of the full gamut of assessment, implementation, and improvement projects. Some we've just done an assessment, so it really differs, but you can see that there's quite a lot of variety here. So one thing we have in our presentation are a number of kind of testimonials. So we've got a number of videos we're going to play for you over the next, I guess, however long we have. And this is our client's view of how she sees working with Scott Madden. This is Alicia Pennick, who works at Turner.
Hi there, I'm Alicia Pennick, VP of Customer Experience, also known as Specialist Organization at Turner Broadcasting.
Can you guys hear?
I've been here for 16 years, and in that time frame, I worked with Scott Madden.
Project that I wrapped up in April of this year. So we helped Turner relaunch their HR service delivery model because they had a service center in place for 5 years, but the change management was not effective when they launched it 5 years ago, and they brought us back and said, we want to do this again. We have investment for technology this time, which they didn't do the last time, and they felt the pain from it. So they said, we now need to put in new systems to help us do this. We need to look at all of our processes again, and we need to make sure people are doing the right work and it's in the right place, and we need to make sure people stick to it this time. So we launched their new and improved model on March 1st of this year, and hopefully it's still going well.
And if I'm looking at the reflection right, that was on your iPhone or
Yeah,
handheld, so that's
it
pretty
was my
stable.
iPhone.
Well done.
Yeah, thank
Well
you.
done.
I was sitting at her desk with my iPhone. Anyway.
Very high tech.
And just to finish up this section, and then I'll turn it over to Adithya to do some more talking. This slide just provides a little bit more detail into what we mean when we say assess, design, build, and improve, or really assess and implement and improve. When we talked a little bit about what can fall into each parts of these projects, but when you're doing an assessment, you're doing things like strategic planning, feasibility analysis, leading practice assessment, project planning, determining stakeholder management, making sure you're getting leadership in the company aligned to what the vision could be, getting them to design something that fits for them, and starting to do some site visits around where might this even sit? Where do we want to do something like this? The design speaks more to what are people in the company doing today? How does HR look? What do the processes look like? What can they look like in the future? Is there a business case for this? We usually do a business case in this time frame in order to make sure there's some return and show people what their investment will look like. We talk about sourcing, organizational design, technology evaluation, implementation planning. The point of this slide is that each one of these things involves a lot of different consulting tools, like Adithya was talking about before. You have to have a pretty broad array of abilities in order to deliver certain parts of these projects. And I think that's part of the reason why Adithya and I have stuck with it after all these years, because I was frankly surprised and impressed by how much we got to get involved in this level of work on these projects. And they're complicated, and I didn't think I ever liked HR. I didn't want to be a part of it. And now, but getting into this level of detail and helping companies figure out what they want to do and what their direction is fascinating. So I'm going to kind of leave it there, but you can see that there's a lot of different things you can do.
Just curious, Molly, so if you look back in the last 4 months, how many times did you meet with the CHRO of Turner?
I mean, when we were getting ready to implement, we met with her every 3 weeks or so.
Right.
So, yeah, monthly.
Right. And you guys did part of training in Turner? Right?
We did.
So about how many hiring managers did you do training with for?
There were 120 people that we trained.
Right. And so that's the part that totally jazzes me up, which is, again, back to that altitude. On every one of these projects, I'm meeting with the COO, CFO of Kaiser about every 3 weeks. But at the same time, I'm meeting with the AP manager
people
on the 9th floor.
Yeah.
I'm to your question, I'm touching everyone in the organization. I'm getting to be a part of that. And there's very few projects where you can do, truly, you run that altitude. And that gets me going.
All right.
All right. So why would you want to work in this? Well, I already said it. We're done. They like to prevent me from talking too much, so we'll start with a video. Matt Christek, just talking a little bit about some of the areas. What we want to do in these next subsequent slides is just give you a flavor of where some of these projects are, what these projects can look like in terms of just a flavor of location and geography, to just give you a sense of what your life may be if you do some corporate and shared services work.
Hello, everyone. Reporting live from the CNN Center in Atlanta, my name is Matt Christek, a senior associate out of the Atlanta office.
He's a manager now.
Since I joined Scott Matt in 2013, I've had the opportunity to be on assignment on a number of different corporate shared services projects. I was at Warner Brothers, helping on a change management project for the launch of a new financial planning tool. There, I worked on marketing communications, working with change agents, and helped with training. I've also been on an assignment at a hospital, HCA, the largest one in the country. There, we helped implement a new HR shared services organization. I worked closely with their talent acquisition or recruiting team on the design of what recruiting would look like in the new model, and worked closely with the business, helping them prepare for launch. I most recently have been here with Turner, formerly Turner Broadcasting. In the fall, I conducted an assessment of their HR organization, and based on our recommendations, we are currently helping them to relaunch their HR organization. I'm working specifically to look at their policies.
This is Matt. He's always got the comedic element to more or less anything. He's a lot of fun to work with.
King of puns.
Lots of puns.
Asking for a few. All right, I'm going to run through these next couple of slides fairly quickly, but again, just to give you a flavor of some of both the clients, but also the locations we've ended up working in over the last several years. there's an element you'll see. I think folks often think of Scott Madden, because of the utility, as very sort of U.S. centric, and we are. There's a lot. The predominant work we do is here, certainly with the utilities, but even in the corporate and shared service space. But it's not to forget that these projects, again, have broad impacts, and many of these companies are global in their nature. And so this is some work at Seagate. Molly, I don't know if you want to maybe talk a little. This was actually Molly's project. There's a funny story you had.
So
Tokyo.
I've done a number of projects at Warner Brothers. We'll talk about one of them in the case study later on. But the international payroll implementation, so we've done 3 global projects there now. They have 30 international locations, and the process change that we've rolled out, we've had to roll out to all 30 international locations. So most of that, 75% of that work was done from the US, was done from Burbank. But you can't be effective without making some trips internationally. So I got to go, or members of my team got to go to, I think, 12 different locations on this project. Some of the places we went to a couple times were Mexico City and London and Hamburg and Paris. Tokyo was an interesting story, which Adithya was just referring to. So I was literally packing my bag and heading to the airport to go to Tokyo for a week the day that the earthquake hit Fukushima. And I was about to leave my hotel, and my phone rang, and it was the SVP at Warner Brothers that was like, "Have you left yet?" And I said, "No, I'm getting ready to head over to the airport right now." And he was like, "Well, did you hear about the earthquake?" And I was like, "Yeah." But there was no concept that it was as bad as it was, or that it had the scale of damage that it was going to be. And so he was like, "I don't think you should go. Let's wait till tomorrow or the next day and see what happens." And so I was like, all right. So I just hung out in LA, kind of waiting to get the signal to go to Tokyo. And finally, after like 3 or 4 days, might have even been longer. It was like almost a week. We finally were like, I think we're going to cancel this trip. We're not going. We'll see if we can.
This looks pretty serious.
We're going to run training from Burbank. We'll see. So we ended up actually postponing their whole go live and shifting it out a number of months to give them a chance to recover. So
Life intrudes.
Yep, life gets in the way sometimes.
Russell Reynolds, you'll see this as well on a couple of the other ones. Again, corporate and shared services, inherently in the name, you'll end up working a lot with HQ, so you'll end up going to their headquarter offices, wherever those may be. And so, again, it just makes for some interesting locations. Verizon, this was an interesting one. It was a finance redesign project. And it was a lot of, again, back to compliance, finance people. We like control. And so there was a lot of international finance rules and regulations that they were trying to manage. They were essentially trying to figure out what they could do out of their Miami hub for the entire Verizon global operations. And so there was a lot of discussions sort of between these two sort of poles of leadership between London and Miami. And so the team would sort of have to go a couple of times between both of these areas. Brad Dement, if you haven't met him, you will in the Atlanta office. He does a lot of Latin American projects. He likes the weather down there. And so you'll see a couple of those examples here. But again, it just makes for a really great and very different kind of experience. Again, you get a whole different corporate culture. You get a whole different, again, change management effort that you go through.
Funny story about Brad Dement. I was working on a presentation for a client last week and sent out a couple feelers for some information on presentations, and he sent me 2 or 3 to answer this question, but he said, one of them is in Spanish, but you'll get the gist anyways. I was like,
big animal pictures.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I don't think I can use any of those slides, but I did get the gist. Thank you.
He did that to me on project. Thankfully, I could read Spanish, so I was able to use it. Not all of the places are entirely sort of in these metropolises and these major hubs, but even then, like the University of Saskatchewan and Saskatoon, even those end up being fun. We had a team that was out there for 2 years.
Yeah, I think
right?
so.
And they were saying, surprisingly, a lot of good restaurants right around the area. So again, corporate and shared services, we find the good ones. I'll sort of skip through. Exxon's a great example. Again, this is where that intersection between shared services and utilities. We do actually a lot of, and you'll see this in some of the examples later on. But again, this speaks to some of the work, even when we work in these areas. Inherently, nuclear plants, right, are not going to be right next door. And so the corporate work inherently just brings you to those corporate locations, whether it's Chicago, whether it's Baltimore. And we do have a lot of cross-pollination between sort of our utility work and our corporate and shared services work. This was a great one, Hawaii. A good friend of mine actually would do this, and it's actually not that close as you think about it from Raleigh and Atlanta. And so they'd sort of go out 2 weeks at a time, which meant that they would spend the weekend in Hawaii and you know, go on to Waikiki Beach, and it was pretty good. He did have a funny story about going to the beach with his partner. That was a little bit maybe not as much fun, but they were good friends. Northrop, again, another Latin America project. This is another fun one. It was actually location analysis. So almost like, think about it like a marketing plan, really trying to, you'll see this a lot of, and it's sort of dying down a little bit when we talk about RPA, but Eastern Europe for a while was talking about, hey, come to us, we're a great location to house your shared services. And so Iceland was saying, hey, can you help us essentially find ways to talk about and promote sort of our location as a particularly good one. So, so again, made for an interesting trip. I think they went out there once, twice, so promote Iceland. Brazil. Yeah, in the right at the good time too. They did this one August through October. Perfect season, perfect time of year to go. And then we'll do one more video to close this section out before we sort of talk about what other things we do in corporate and shared services.
Hi, my name is Jonathan, and welcome to the boardroom at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm a current associate at Scott Madden.
I think John is currently working out at Cedars-Sinai in LA. That's where his project is right now.
Yeah, that's right. So want to make sure we talk a little bit about some of the, I'll say, adjacent topics. And I say adjacent, not to, they're actually fairly central, but folks have a tendency to think about corporate and shared services in those words, right? HR, finance, sort of these very functionally deep areas. And I think you can sometimes underestimate or potentially ignore all the other work we do, both to get HR and finance and IT to function the way they need to, but also some of the work that's sort of not in your prototypical corporate and shared services bucket. So these next couple of slides, we're sort of talk through a little bit of that. 1994, man, it's a long time. I need to change my elevator pitch. It's 23 years.
Yeah.
160 technology projects. So tech is a big part of what we do. You can sort of hear it in any of our work. In order to fundamentally change how a company is doing its work, it's hard to do that without an element of technology, without a large element of technology. And so both part of larger projects, but also independent contained projects on their own. Tech is a big part of what you'll experience, what you'll learn, what you'll do. And you sort of can see the breakdown, again, very similar to the broader shared service footprint in terms of assessments, implementations, or selections, sort of improvement work, et cetera. You learn a good chunk of that work. And again, I think about it again as another tool in your tool set. It's part of what makes you a good consultant, but it's also a completely different way of thinking, a completely different set of folks that you engage with on the IT side of the house versus sort of on the HR side of the house. The flavor of what we do in that space is traditionally, and you'll sort of see this, we're the, I'll say the generalists. We're the translators of business to IT. So you'll see the role that we play in these when it comes to technology is much more in sort of that PMO, the general strategy, sort of the design component. But you'll notice sort of the blue around the value, and it's back to sort of that functional depth. What we do a little bit differently, and I think why folks particularly like the work we do in the technology space, is while we're good at the general stuff, we get to know enough about the technology to at least play an intelligent role. So we're not the developers, but we know enough to be able to do that translation. And what I hear a lot of when clients talk about this is we act as a bridge in ways that both consultants but also their internal partners can't. Right? How many times have you heard IT knows what they're doing, I just don't understand it, and vice versa. IT is going, I have no clue what they're trying to do. They're saying something, but I don't get what the requirement is. And so we act as a good bridge. Give you a flavor of a technology example. I worked at Adithya, where I was a project management manager running a complete outsourcing of their IT infrastructure to an Indian company. So global IT out to an Indian company, about $125 million engagement, about 200 implementers at its height, a good 90% of which were in India. And I was the singular project management overhead to sort of manage that entire project. And so again, it was that you need to know enough about networks and servers, et cetera, to be able to call BS when you see it, but you don't need to be the developer. You don't need to be the network manager. And so it just gives you a great flavor of, besides sort of your traditional corporate and shared service work, there's plenty of other work we do as well. Within a corporate and shared service function, and this is sort of irrespective of area, and you heard Molly talk through this, portals, case management systems, IVR, knowledge base. Technology is integral to making these things work. And so you'll learn and you'll experience and you'll get to be proficient in a lot of these. And again, that's part of the excitement I have, which is you're constantly adding tools to your tool set. Besides sort of those things that are, I'll say, irrespective of function, you can sort of see the component pieces of some of the examples of things you'll learn. Molly actually has done a good amount of work with a particular HR ERP called Workday. And as a result, we now come back to her, and I've actually had clients, I've asked Molly questions that I can then bring back to clients specifically around Workday because they're evaluating that particular piece of technology. You guys know this as well or better than I do, that the world is changing, right? Even mobile applications are starting to become front and center. So most recently at HCA, I got exposed to trying to understand and help a particular case management technology tool develop their mobile app, because again, folks weren't going to want to get on the portal. They'll want to get on the portal, but they want to get on it via their mobile device. And they were testing it out, and I was along for the ride, and it was a great learning experience about APIs and how that works. Again, not because I was going to develop it, but I needed to know enough so that I could keep us out of trouble and make sure this project went off without a hitch.
Yeah, what we're usually doing in this context is being the representative for the employee or the customer, trying to maintain their point of view so that what we're delivering is actually going to be something that they've either asked for or they wanted. And we're also usually trying to validate requirements. So since we've been on the front end of why are you doing this, what do you need, what are the specific requirements, we have to make sure that those are realized. And so even when it comes to a mobile app, if we said, well, we said that they are going to be able to get this part via tier 0 and the process is going to look like this, when it comes to testing this kind of stuff, we're usually the ones who catch, this is not doing what we said it was going to do. We need to go back and figure out why it isn't. And so while we're, like Adithya said, we're not the ones who are figuring out the code on how to fix it, but we're saying it doesn't do this and it needs to do this. And let's go fix it before we go live.
We act as pretty good translators because, again, as I'm sure you all know, you'll invariably find stuff that it doesn't work the way we said it was going to, and it won't. And
Right.
so you have to figure out, and you've worked at that point with your client enough to know this is a deal breaker, this isn't. We can sort of work around this one.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit, Tony, to your question of RPA, you'll sort of see this a little bit further, but technology is fundamentally changing the nature of the game. And so it's even changing the work we're doing. So ERPs, how necessary are they anymore? What can you do with sort of an RPA sort of as a bolt-on solution, and for how long? You know, I love this little call out here on the right. Companies are becoming knowledge-based companies, right? It's less and less about the brick and mortar. It's about the knowledge and the data you have. World's largest taxi company, no taxi. Media owner, no content. Accommodation, no real estate. I mean, they don't actually have any of the stuff. They have all of the interconnection. They've got the neural network for it. And that's fundamentally changing some of the work we're doing, which we'll talk about. The piece that I get asked from folks who start up is, Adithya, what do I need to know and how much of it? And I usually call out three things. You need to know what it is, right? So new technology, RPA, you need to know what RPA is. You need to know how it can impact the work you're doing. So you need to have a couple, 1 to 2 real life examples of what that particular thing is. So not just what it is, but how is it being used. And then the last piece is you need to then translate that to your client. So one is just the what. The second sort of helps make it real for your client. The third shows your consulting skills, because you go and say, this is how others have used it, 1 or 2 examples. Here's how I see it potentially being useful for you. You've armed that client with, in a matter of 10 minutes, sort of the basic structure and framework by which they can go and do some more research. So you don't need to know everything, but if you can answer those 3 questions around some of these key technologies, good.
Yeah, I mean,
You're on
in
your
full
way.
disclosure, we're sometimes only days or weeks ahead of our clients on some of this stuff. I mean,
That's right.
it's, you know, we realize it's something that could be applied in this manner. You think, okay, I really now have to go get smart on how, you know, this particular technology can help in this situation. And we, you know, spend the time doing the research and figuring things out. You just have to be a little bit faster and figure out real world applicability to how these things can work. So sometimes we're just a little bit ahead.
Yeah.
Sometimes we know it because we've done it before, but you know,
That's right.
as things are changing, it is challenging to keep up with all the new trends.
I'm always trying to figure out what's real and what's buzz, because again, our clients also value that
They ask
piece,
that,
right?
yeah.
Where they say, is this something I need to look at or not? And so you need to have at least an opinion on it and sort of define that with your team. The last piece before we get into these other slides is the takeaway I would have as you look at these slides is follow your passion, right? So you'll see here in a couple of examples, there's a bunch of work we do, but there's, as Molly said, there's new stuff coming every day. And you'll actually see, I'll talk through an example of 2 folks who they had a passion for a particular area, and it's now become sort of a series of projects that they continue to work on, and they've gotten certifications on it. And so there are no boundaries, right? If there is something that's sort of adjacent that exists and is of interest to you, go research it, go learn about it. So I'll talk through a couple of items in terms of technologies within corporate shared services space that you'll want to know and start to learn a little bit more about. Advanced interactive voice response, IVR, speech technology. Again, how many of you, to that Delta example, you know, not all of us are diamond, triple, quadruple diamond like Molly, so we get the, not the agent, but the automated person that picks our call first. But they're getting smarter. They're not only getting smarter in recognizing your speech, but in terms of trying to identify the implicit question behind what you have. And so those systems are starting to become more and more into play. And again, they allow, why is this important to corporate and shared services? They allow you to move more and more to that tier 0. The more you've got an intelligent front end, the more basic questions you can answer without anyone ever having to try and interface with that. The less agents you have, or the more focused your agents can be on the stuff that is really more complicated. I'll talk a little bit about the visual interface in another one, but how many of you in your recent history here did mobile Skype interviews? Right? So you're starting to see, I mean, 5 years ago, that wasn't going to happen. And so now you're starting to see that. How does that apply again to the service center component? How do these technology components start to affect the work we do? Can you start to actually have a few less HR business partners in the field and start to replace that with sort of a front-end Skype-like component? Question mark. RPA, as Tony mentioned, the question here. RPA is, our perspective is RPA is real. RPA is going to be here to stay, particularly as you get to the next page where I'll talk about cognitive and artificial intelligence. But you're actually seeing very real examples of RPA in place now. There's some bumps, so we're seeing also some cold water being splashed on sort of the, this term is really on fire. There are some bumps, but it's creating efficiencies and it's removing sort of a lot of the manual interfaces without the heavy cost of implementing an ERP, which again, 15 years ago, ERP was a solution to a lot of these things. You're hearing RPA come into play. Again, the way it affects corporate and shared services, you're actually starting to hear, so offshoring, outsourcing used to be a big thing, right? Is still a big thing. Corporate and shared services deals with that, right? How much of your shared service work do you actually offshore? What you're seeing with RPA is folks are actually completely reconsidering that, because if I've got RPA and I implement RPA in a very real way, maybe I don't need to move my services out to India, as an example. Maybe I can actually keep them in North America, but actually just change the mix of who's doing what. And so this is actually fundamentally affecting sort of the model and some of the strategies that we're seeing our clients put into play. And then this isn't real, at least in my opinion, just yet, but it's going to be. So everything I'm hearing and reading is 3 to 5 years. There are some early examples. I don't know, who here may have heard of Clara or Amy? Yeah? So you guys should take a look at it when you get a chance. These are average scheduling assistants. You give them access to your calendar, you give them a bunch of rules. They'll actually, so think about busy exec, they'll actually email. So I email head of HR and I say, hey, Tess, I'd like to meet with you on XYZ day. Amy, the virtual assistant, will interface with me, manage Tessa's calendar, and do all, like write emails, set up calendars, reschedule. If Tess says, I don't want to see Adithya and says ixnay, Amy will send a very nicely worded email to Adithya and say, sorry, Tess got busy, whatever it is. And she actually starts to learn what your preferences are. Yeah, so Tessa, actually, you can probably speak to this as an example.
You're right on point. I mean, it's just amazing how this is actually going to take over and really start to mimic our communication styles as individuals.
Yeah.
That's pretty genius.
It is. Again, they're reading sort of your phraseology, and so she's trying to mimic how and what Tess would say.
Even like the tones and inflections and the way that you write, it's incredible.
Yeah. Amelia, who you see right here, is actually a cognitive agent. So she gets smarter the more she is used. So again, it's not real yet. It is getting, we're 3 to 5 years away, and that's going to fundamentally shift how we think about the structures of what's a service center, what's in a service center, what we do in a service center, how we staff that service center, which is going to be huge. So you guys are right in time, because I don't have an answer just yet. Couple of slides here on cybersecurity. So this is the example of, again, following your passion. So there's cybersecurity is a big deal, as you all hear it regularly in the news. The crossover here with utilities, you think about our grid and how it's becoming much more electronic. AMIs, advanced metering systems, are sort of opening the door to a bunch of cybersecurity risk as well. And so the crossover between shared service work and utility work. This is a pretty good nexus. And so there's a little bit of, again, background into what it is, what we've done here. Folks get it. They understand that they need to work it. They don't know exactly what they need to work. And so we've actually come in and done some work for a couple of clients. And we actually have two folks in particular that, again, it's been their passion, and they've specialized in it, and now they're actually getting to be relatively well-known in a couple of these circles in terms of thought leaders, in terms of what they can do and papers they're writing. I won't read through a whole lot of these. Back to that's top right-hand box. Folks know they need to do it, but less than 30% of orgs feel they have sufficient resources to achieve security and regulatory compliance. They don't have the skill sets, but their leaders also don't know what to go after. They don't know what to solve for first. And so they understand there's a threat, but they're sort of throwing their hands up and going, I don't know where to start. So I'll just talk through some of the things we have done and what we do. So typical sort of maturity assessment, but we have a framework around cybersecurity, around what we see and what we use and what we think is good. And so we assess them on that. We actually do a fairly in-depth strategy, security management, sort of defense set of mechanisms. Again, from simple things like what are your protocols, what are your access management systems, what are the protocols around your access management, who gets access to what, access management provisioning. We've actually helped develop sort of an ongoing assessment methodology for clients so that we not just do it once, but we actually teach them how to fish so that they can continue to get better. We've actually done education to the organization on just what is cybersecurity so that they can stop saying, I know it's a problem, but I don't know what it is. You can actually teach leaders about it. We've actually done a bunch of staff augmentation. So because we've gotten fairly good at this, folks have said, why don't you just come and do it for us for a little while until we can find the right folks? And so we've actually got individuals that have done that. They have been sort of the cybersecurity individuals that have helped keep this going.
I think just to add a little bit of more like real world context to why cybersecurity matters, it's really important to people who run large HR organizations and payroll organizations to keep their employee data safe, right? And so I was out at Warner Brothers working on the Workday implementation that Adithya mentioned when Sony got hacked. So you guys remember that. And it was a big deal in the entertainment industry. All the studios freaked out because it was basically a disgruntled employee who, at Sony, who made all of this confidential information, available to the world, and could see, emails of conversations of big stars. And anyway, so Warner Brothers, rightfully so, was really worried, like, oh my gosh, what does this mean to us? And so, immediately the VP who we were working for, who runs HR and payroll at Warner Brothers is a big deal. I mean, when you pay people like Clint Eastwood and Chuck Lorre and, George Clooney, you don't want that information getting out. And so they immediately put a number of kind of near-term recommendations from cybersecurity recommendations just to protect making sure the practices of the people who have access to that data was in place. I mean, it's spun off a much larger project. It's kind of still going on. There's a lot of infrastructure involved in it. But immediately, some of the near-term things that they could do, they did. And so it has a lot of real-world application for the people that we work for in HR and finance.
I don't know how many of you have interfaced. It scares me regularly, but people data in Excel,
yep.
Shipped over via email. Yeah, that it's not going over anyone else's network, but if you were to get hacked, that'll be easier to find than something that's sort of under control and under lock and key systemically. Okay, cybersecurity as an adjacent topic. Another one which I'm sure you guys have heard of a lot: analytics, big data. we're seeing this a lot in the shared services space. And again, to the follow your passion, this is one of those things that about 5 years ago, I said, gosh, it was getting buzz, and I thought I'd like to learn a little bit more about this. So I've started going to conferences and so forth, and started to learn about it, again, just for my own edification. But it's actually started to turn into a couple of projects and again, content that we want to create and know about. I won't go through all the details here around sort of analytics versus metrics, but it's important to distinguish, because a lot of folks still combine these. Reporting and analytics are two different things. The piece that I always like to call out is there's what the problem is, there's so what. All right, so if I know what the problem is, so what? What do I do about it? And there's now what, which is if I do something, what will that create? And so analytics is on the so what and the now what side. The what is just reporting. And what you'll typically find is when folks talk analytics, they're still in the what. They're still just trying to figure out what the heck just happened. They aren't trying to figure out just yet. They aren't good enough yet to figure out, not just, I already know what happened. I trust that the data showing me is what happened. So what? What do I do now? And the really good ones are saying, they've already got the what and they've already got the so what. They're saying, now let me actually model this out. So if I pull this lever, now what will happen? And that's analytics. It's sort of on the other side of that spectrum. It's not the data, it's the actual analysis, hence analytics. You'd be surprised how many clients still, they say analytics. They love the word. They're talking about reporting. Analytics versus big data. What we do here and what we do in this space is we aren't sort of the experts in big data, right? The 3 V's, what is it? Velocity, vector, I forget what the third V is. All of volume, thank you. Yeah, volume, velocity, and vector around big data. We're not the experts in data warehousing and how you go about mining that data. What we are going to help you, though, with is, again, the analysis. Again, this is where I think consultants have a natural skill set and natural intellectual curiosity. It's, okay, get the right data sets, get the right tools to measure and pull out information. Now you have this information, what do you do with it? From the form of the skill sets of individuals you hire to go do this, to how you actually present it visually, so that you can actually get the right components. We actually set up two analytics centers with clients here in the recent years, where we actually hired analytics folks. We actually brought in tools, both visualization tools like Tableau, but also hired developers, analytics developers, R, Python sort of developers, to actually work these efforts and ultimately help the client sort of shepherd that into fruition to actually have an analytics expertise, not just a reporting one. So it's interesting work. It's not at all in the space of HR, finance, and IT specifically, but this is sort of the stuff you get to play with. Big words again. Analyzing with greater speed, velocity, more sophisticated, granular insights. Again, I don't think there's anything surprising in this work. What I'd say is, again, the application is in a variety of places. So even if you're working in HR analytics is a big deal. If you're working in finance analytics is a big deal. And so your ability to at least understand it, know it, and speak to it in a couple of different flavors. Again, back to those 3 questions that I highlighted. You'll be well off as you start a corporate insured service project. I don't know that I'll spend a whole lot of time on this other than to say, again, similar to RPA, analytics is, I'd say it's still buzzword, but it's real. I don't think that statement of the obvious, but it's real and it's getting bigger. The piece, similar to ERPs were 15 years ago, clients are struggling with the how. They get that they should be doing analytics, they don't know how to harness that big data power, whether it's because they don't have the right people or they don't have the right approach. We've actually done a couple of white papers on structurally what you can start to think about in terms of analytics as a center of expertise. Okay, I think second to last video, and then we're going to have a quick game to break it up a little bit, and then we'll talk cases.
Hi, I'm Betsy Curry, and in my 2 years at Scott Madden, I've had the pleasure of working on 2 corporate...
Okay, so now we're going to do a bit of an exercise. Do feel free during this time to take a break if you guys need to. But we're going to pair you up and do a little card matching game. And so in each of these stacks, there is an equal number of client names, so actual corporation names, and a description of who they are or what their industry is. So again, just a little mental break for you guys to get some more exposure to the type. All these are current clients or clients within the past couple years. And so we'll give you 10 minutes or so, and feel free to get up and take a break in the meantime as well.
Yeah, and have you guys been sitting in the same spot yesterday to today?
Do you feel like mixing it up?
So yeah, let's pair you guys up crosswise.
All right. All right, so
Get you guys moving.
I'll give cards to this side of the table. Everybody stand up, take some deep breaths.
That's right.
Hopefully we're not
Stretch
putting
out.
you to sleep, but we're not going to check your answers. Does anybody? I'm sure you got them all 100% right. Did anybody have any questions about not being sure who is who? Oh, you had an extra card.
Oh yeah, we were missing a card on the other one. So.
Well, that's all right.
And the point of the exercise really was to give you a flavor of the different kinds of companies you end up working with on the corporate and shared services side. It can be pretty varied. No, don't worry.
Okay, so we're about to close out this section. I think we've got one more client testimonial for you guys. This is Wade Epp from University of Saskatchewan. And
Wade is not going to talk to us.
play. Okay, let's see.
Hi, I'm Wade, Director of Service Design for the
Consultants at Scott Madden, which is adaptability and flexibility. As you guys know, we always talk about how important that is, but it really comes to play when you're sitting in rooms with your various clients and you've agreed on things all along, and all of a sudden they'll say, you know what, I'm not sure we like that decision anymore. And you can say, well, the reason why we decided it is, X, Y, and Z, and try to bring them back to the core reason of why. But a lot of times they don't want to do it anymore. They've changed their mind. Something in the model or in the decision doesn't strike them right anymore. And so that flexibility of saying, okay, well, we're doing this, we need to do this. The fact that you've changed this means we need to do these things, but we're still marching towards all of these other things. It happens a lot, and it happens all the time in implementation. So starting to get that flexibility and the confidence in saying, all right, well, this is the model and this is the plan. We need to stick with this, but these are some of the things we can change to be able to make it unique to you. You'll hear any of us on the shared services side, especially Scott Manning, say in all of the implementations we've done, we've never done the same thing twice, because every company is different and ends up putting their little spin of flavor on it. And so it makes things interesting and it keeps you learning. So in the next section, we're going to talk briefly deeper about a couple projects. I'll take this one at Warner Brothers, and then Adithya is going to talk about one at Kaiser. And we have about 25 minutes left to our presentation, so we may move a little bit fast during this section because we want to make sure we cover everything. So this particular project was a global payroll standardization. And it was a process in which I mentioned WB had 30 international locations. And corporate finance came to the realization that they really had no idea what the various entities, the finance entities in each country, were doing from a payroll and a reporting perspective. And payroll is one of those things, especially when you get international, that is extremely sensitive to regulatory and compliance. There's a lot of rules that takes quite a bit of specialized knowledge to know what are the different rules in Thailand versus the Philippines. And they had one or two issues with employees internationally that raised the risk from a compliance perspective. And they thought, do we really have control over what's going on internationally from a payroll perspective? And so control, compliance, and reporting were really the drivers for this change. And so they had decided that they wanted to go from this kind of multiple payroll system, multiple interaction. So they had a common HRIS system in PeopleSoft, which has now been replaced by Workday, by the way. They had people running payroll in each country with a different vendor and a different kind of system that all fed into SAP. So they were getting the information, but a lot of the information had to be manipulated before it ended up in the final report into SAP. And so their goal was to go from a single HRIS system to a single vendor, a provider of services internationally, which was Safeguard International, which all then fed into SAP in the same format. And so this was to provide visibility, control, compliance, et cetera, across the board. And they were doing this because they were getting ready to unhook PeopleSoft and replace it with Workday, and they wanted to have, Safeguard was also a company that had a relationship with Workday and had some built-in integrations that they could use. So this is the project team structure that we worked on at WB. And so you'll see the scope from an employee perspective was small. They only have 3,200 employees internationally across the 30 countries. And so that meant in some countries there were literally 6 or 7 employees, and there was one person, running payroll for a small group focused internationally. They were focused very much on consumer products and distribution. So that's what a number of these small companies were doing. In their bigger offices, like in Paris and in London, they had upwards of 300 people. So there was some differences, but the scale of employees was small. The complexity came from us having to do each country at a time, because every single one has their own rules and their own requirements. So the vendor, Safeguard, made up one work stream here. You can see, and then we had the project lead, who was the executive director of international services, and then project management. And so this is Scott Madden, this is Scott Madden, this is Scott Madden, and this is Scott Madden. So we filled in from a project management, functional, and change management and testing perspective. And we often, as you will come to be exposed to, work with other vendors on these project teams, especially technology vendors. So as Adithya mentioned, when we're doing these types of implementations, the vendor is the technical expert, and we're the ones kind of helping all the other pieces run. You can see overall, the project was 23 months. We averaged 2.5 resources from Scott Madden the whole time, so there was some turnover because it was such a long project. We did deliberate turnover. So we try to keep people, especially in the associate and senior associate ranks, on projects for only about a year and then move them off so that we can expand learning and experience. And so that is what we did here. And then overall the project was, I think, 2.5 million in fees. Because there were so many countries, and we needed to roll it out in kind of a staggered fashion. So we grouped all of the countries into waves. And we had a project plan that we basically ran in a 4-month period of time and repeated it over and over and over as we went into each one of these country groups. So our pilot, we started out in Asia, so Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. And interesting fact about this project is that Warner Brothers had originally contracted Accenture to do this work. And they were involved in the vendor selection and doing requirements gathering for all of the countries. And then they had an implementation plan that they put together. Well, they couldn't get any countries live. They tried, I guess, for 6 or 8 months from their planned implementation plan and couldn't get any of the countries to go live. So we had done work with them before, and a client called up and said, I really need some help. Will you guys come in and figure out what's going wrong? What are they doing wrong? And if basically we're like, if you guys can help us get these countries live, you can have the rest of the implementation. So we did it. We came in and 3 months later went live with the first 4 countries. And a lot of it came down to validation of technical aspects. So what we were talking about before is making sure that what we said was going to happen was actually happening with the solution. And the other was change management and training. The reason why they couldn't get countries live is because there was a lot of resistance. People didn't want to change. And so they kept saying, no, we're not ready. No, that's not right. Because a lot of things weren't right. They weren't ready to go. So over the course of the next number of months, our project team did change a little bit. We kept one of the Accenture consultants on the team with us the whole time. She was pretty deep in the functional requirements. So the team ended up being mostly Scott Madden, WB, Safeguard, and one Accenture consultant. So it was an interesting mix. Got some light issues going on. So you can see over the course of from the end of 2012 to the end of 2014 with this kind of rolling plan in which we covered planning, data gathering, system build, testing, and launch, we were able to get all 30 countries live. Some of the challenges, local policy and compliance certainty. I mean, we had to rely on internal country payroll providers to really make sure that we were getting the requirements right. Scott Madden we can document and pull all the information that we can find on what the requirements are, but it's definitely hard for us to validate whether or not this is right for Belgium. And so using in-country legal counsel and in-country payroll providers to validate those requirements was something that we had to do a lot of for each one of these countries. So obviously that meant some time zone challenges. We were on the phone at all hours of the day with various in-country resources. We tried to schedule the plan so we were working with APAC all at once or Latin America or Europe so that we didn't have to burn the candle on both ends. But it did happen at times where we would be meeting with Turkey at 6 a.m. and Hong Kong at 8 p.m. So it just, we tried to do our best, but it did happen. So the vendor also was new, and not so much new, but they were, like vendors do, go through these growth phases where they sold a whole lot of products and projects and didn't have experienced people to then deliver. And so we ended up having to fill in the gaps quite a bit on making sure that the requirements were validated and that we could deliver things on time when the company wasn't particularly confident in their ability to do so. Let's see. Takeaways. Design and guiding principles was a big one. Because we kept going for so long on this project and met with multiple country leadership over and over and over again, it ended up being extremely key, like even more important than we thought it was going to be. We spent a lot of time on key design decisions at the beginning of the project. So we had buy-in from all the executives in corporate finance. We had buy-in from country leadership on what the key design principles of what we were going after were. And we kept coming back to them because, 12 months down the line when we start talking to a new country and they're like, why do we have to do this again? We could go back to say, this is why, and this is what we're going to stick with. That was important. Having a strong executive steering committee, going back to change leadership and stakeholder management is really important. It's important for all projects, but in this case, we really needed that executive steering committee to help influence some of the local leaders. A lot of these local country leaders had been running their own like fiefdoms in country for many, many years, and we are coming in and disrupting all of that and saying you can't do this anymore. And so we really, as the consultant, we were often the bearer of bad messages. And so we would go in and be like, sorry, this is what you have to do. But we could always go back and count on the executive team to support us in that, and that was key. I think that's it. Any questions? Yeah.
Is it pretty common where the vendors kind of get on the customer success side and you guys have to fill in those gaps, or is that unique to this project?
It's definitely not unique. It happens a lot. It's not always, most of the time what I've found is these vendor teams have the best interests at heart. They really want to do what they're there to do, but frankly, a lot of them aren't trained in the types of skill sets that you need to implement something correctly. They're very technical. They know the system really well. They're there because they helped deliver this product, and they were good salespeople, but not necessarily good implementers, and they don't understand the way that the shared services business is supposed to work. And so I think it's often why we end up getting paired with system implementations, because we focus on the way it's actually going to work in the company. How does it fold into your business processes? How do people use it? They're not trained, and that's not how those companies are set up to run.
Even with other consultants, I'd say the big thing that you'll hear is, how should we do it, right? And the prototypical consultant will say, you do it this way. And I think Scott Madden, what we'll say is, well, this is how others have done it. Now let's talk about how it could work for you.
Right.
And that's a nuance, but it's ultimately a very big difference, because it can work a lot of different ways. Let's talk about how it can work for you.
Right.
All right, I'm going to take 5 minutes and I'm going to skip a couple of slides, so I'll apologize in advance. This is some work that we're doing right now with Kaiser Permanente out in California. Mike's going to be joining us there over the summer. And who knows, a couple of you guys may be joining us as well, depending upon how things go over the next several months. Big company, nonprofit. You can sort of see the numbers. I won't go through them, but it's fairly unique in that it has both the insurance and the care, right? So with the sort of care and coverage, they actually have hospitals. So you go to a Kaiser hospital, but you also have Kaiser insurance. So in Georgia here, actually in the Atlanta offices, I think a couple of floors up from you is a Kaiser office. So that's the insurance side. They actually work with a bunch of hospital systems in Georgia. So those aren't Kaiser hospitals, but they have the insurance piece, the coverage piece in Georgia, as an example. So what are we doing with them? I'll skip this piece. We're working truly in the strategy space. So when we talked about sort of that functional depth, that's not what this project is. You can sort of see it. Very hard to have functional depth when you're working across this kind of breadth. What's very cool about this project is that it is non-traditional. So we're not working in HR or in finance or in IT. We're truly working at a strategy level across pretty much a huge footprint of the organization. You can sort of see some of the words up there. There's very few administrative functions that we are not engaging and touching. And so similar to the guiding principles that Molly talked about, what you'll see is what grounds us is we had to work for an extended period of time on a shared service framework that would work for all these folks. So regardless of whether I'm talking claims, I'm talking revenue cycle, I'm talking telehealth or EICU, I've got a model and a language that I can talk. So whether you're AP or I'm EICU, we're both shared services. And that's a hard thing to pull off. And it's hard for them to absorb. But that framework is essentially our version of the guiding principles. It's something we can keep coming back to say, no, this is what it can look like. This is what shared services does. Why are they doing that? Ultimately, you can sort of see it, right? The impact of this group is about $3.4 billion and about 16,000 employees, just this group. So larger than many companies out there. And so How do you create efficiency? How do you create the right kinds of controls? You can imagine with things like pharmacy, you kind of want controls that are in place. You don't want sort of a pharmacist pulling off a dosage somewhere and doing some funny business with it. How do you start to put all of these things in place? Talking shared services, and how do you start to make that work? What you'll see is historically Kaiser has taken what we would see in a lot of companies. One group does one thing, another group does another thing, another group does yet another thing. They're all trying to work towards efficiencies. There's no malintent, but they're all doing it very differently. And so the business units are going, I don't know what's happening, because I talk to Elizabeth and she talks to me in one way, and I talk to Christina and she talks to me in a completely different way, and I don't know how to make heads or tails of it as I run my business. I'll touch on this page here. This, I think, is a great view into how a lot of these Scott Madden projects work. I think you've heard it before. We're a relationship company. You'll sort of see we came in with an intention and a need to help them in a certain area. And what's happened is over time, that's started to shift off. And the reason we're still helping them is because they started to trust us. They start to go, we need your help. We need you to help us think this through. Not, you've got the answer. It's, we need to help with our thinking. And that's a big, again, similar to that sort of solutioning, that's a big difference. They're not saying, just give us the cookie cutter and let's go. We've Kaiserized a lot of this work. But they're saying, you get us, help us think this one through. And so we're still with them. We're going to be with them through year end. And like I said, Mike's going to help us with some of this work. But it's all grounded in this shared service expertise, this shared service framework, which is essentially our guiding principles. I won't go through this again just for lack of time, but just know that they were struggling mightily with just consistency. They didn't have a framework that they could really build off of. They had put one in, and for a lot of different reasons it wasn't working. And again, it wasn't working because it wasn't their language. It was somebody else's language that they said, okay, that looks good, let's try it, and it didn't work, it didn't stick. So this is what it ended up becoming, which is what we're using as sort of our bedrock. A little bit more complicated, but again, they needed complicated to essentially be able to speak to all the different nuances across these 22 different shared service areas. What we started to talk through, and this I think is going to be useful as you all sort of deal and play in shared services, sort of to pull full circle. Molly at the beginning talked to you about shared services, right? We have HR shared services and finance shared services and multifunction. And you may recall Molly was saying many companies start with one, right? They start and say, I'll do an HR shared service. And then they sort of start to move that along and start to bring more shared services along. This is another way to say just that. You start with a single function, you start going to multifunction, and then you go into what we call GBS or Global Business Services. And so we're trying to paint the picture, and you can sort of see a lot of people, they play in this area and they stay in this area. But there are folks that are starting to move up that curve, and they're seeing the benefits of moving up that curve. And so this is part of the work that we're pitching and working with Kaiser. Pretty big impact, like I said. This is at $3.4 billion. This is not chump change. So CEOs looking at it and going to the board and saying, we're going to save X, and so we got to help them figure that out. I won't go through this, but again, the value here is it's quite different, and it's, even though it's corporate and shared services, we've got a lot of different types of projects that we're working one from the next. I'll skip these so that Molly can talk a little bit about shared service practice and how we're organized.
So in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to give you guys a quick introduction into who the leadership of the service, corporate and shared services practice is. So these are some faces you guys may remember or from your interview process, or you've met already, or you will meet over the course of this week. This is the structure and leadership. So Scott Manning is our practice lead. And then we have 4 branches, plus Karen, who covers kind of all of them. So we've got Brad Dement as the finance and multifunction lead, Courtney Jackson as our HR, HCM lead, John Kerner as the tech lead, and Andy Flores as the supply chain lead. And Karen Hilton leads, you guys are going to meet her this afternoon, she leads the research function, which is based out of Raleigh. It includes our survey business and all of the benchmarking and leading practice work that we do as well. So she covers all of those pieces. I hear that you guys already talked about COPs this morning, so everybody, or maybe it was yesterday, so everybody understands what the COPs are, right? So the Corporate and Shared Services Organization is organized through communities of practice, and it's led by those 4 people that I talked to already. So we'll go through quickly who the people are and what the COPs are. I do welcome all of you guys to join and participate in any of those COPs, just to listen in and see what's going on. If you have a particular interest in one of the areas, join or sit in all of them. So it's really a good way to learn about what's going on in the market. And we try to talk about trends and market competition and do some case study reviews, so they're interesting. So you can see our supply chain experts, Andy with our lead, and then Mark Miller, Jordan Gillis, Kim Davenport, and John Francis. For finance and accounting and our multifunction, Brad Dement leads that. And you've already met Trey, Honorio, Jason Davis, and Adithya are also known as the finance experts in the firm. Human resources, Courtney leads the COP, and Scott, Trish, Jared, Laura Campbell, and myself are all known as the HR experts with a lot of depth in HR. And then we've got our IT, or I think it's just called the Tech COP now, which John Kerner leads, and Dave Adams, Henry Bell, and TJ Hart are all experts in that area. Henry specifically is cybersecurity, what we had mentioned before. He spends a lot of time in that space. Then you've got our research team. So Karen, as I mentioned, you'll meet shortly. Mike Christopher leads the survey business. So we have Qualtrics as a survey tool, and he runs all of our surveys, which we do quite a bit of on the corporate and shared services side. And then Min is an amazing researcher. She churns out so much research, and if you ask her about benchmarks, she's great. So she can really help you put information, get information under your fingertips really quickly.
And that's really what I would try and take from all these slides is we're all pretty accessible, open folks. And so these are names to start to just know, so that as you have questions, as you get on a project that's a supply chain project, you just have a feeler out to say, hey, can I just pick your brain for 15 minutes? Just give me a quick overview, something like that allows you to just start to get a leg up, start to learn about the space, start to engage.
Yeah, and often when you start working on a shared services project, the partner or director will say, well, I want you to give Molly a call, or sit down and talk to Adithya about such and such, because one, people are very willing to share experience with clients. They're also very willing to share specific project kind of lessons learned that you may want to apply on the next piece, and also help just point you in the direction of content that you can use to get your project started. So we're going to close with one more video. This is Janet Gilmore from HCA.
My name is Janet Gilmore, and I'm a Vice President in Human Resources at HCA, a large hospital and healthcare company based in the U.S.
So we hope you got excited about the corporate and shared services practice area today. Hope you learned something. We exposed you to a lot, but hopefully you can at least start to talk the talk. And we welcome you guys, so thank you for joining, and I think that's about it. If you guys have questions, we'll take any, but we also know we're about out of time. Anything else? Okay.
I think lunch is out there.